It's 5 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Danny Berger with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know on this Tuesday morning. Ceasefire tested. Israel accuses Iran of a new missile launch after a truce announced by President Trump. Iran reportedly denies the accusation. A tax bill compromise. Senate Republicans consider an agreement on assault provision as they aim to pass the legislation next week. And Fed Chair Powell heads to Capitol Hill for his semi-annual policy report. It is fragility in geopolitics that is really being tested and tried this morning. What is the state of this ceasefire? Unknown at this moment. But it doesn't matter for these oil markets. They continue to decline. We are now at the levels before really this whole conflict started to evolve. We're below $70 a barrel. At one point yesterday, they opened at $80 a barrel, with reports that Iran fired missiles into Israel, which Iran reportedly has denied. You can see what happened to oil. Some of the losses started to ease. They picked back up. But again, we're still down 3% in the day. The risk on rally, that also is unimpeded by the headlines coming in. We are up more than 1% on the NASDAQ, and especially for small caps, S&P 500 futures up 0.8%. Now, one of the reasons that small caps here are outperforming is because of what's happening in the bond market. Yes, lower oil prices is helping, but you can see the rally concentrated on the front end of the curve, down 3 basis points, with Mickey Bowman yesterday saying that she could get behind a July cut. Quite the change for a member of the FOMC who tends to be more hawkish. So you can see the long end isn't playing along, so some real curve steepening. Let's look now at the stocks on the move in the pre-market. With that is Joe Easton. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Danny. So we are seeing some decent moves higher in the airline stocks today. It is a twofold impact. Firstly, that crude oil price drop that you mentioned there, retracing a lot of the gains over the past few weeks. So we're seeing potentially better sentiment around jet fuel coming in, lifting the likes of American, United, Delta and JetBlue this morning, and also some companies resuming traffic into the Persian Gulf in terms of key airlines and key airports like Dubai as well. So keep an eye on that sector today. Then we've got Starbucks potentially spinning off its Chinese unit. Now, this is according to a couple of reports overnight. The Starbucks actually, in the latest comment, denying that they're going to do this. But the CEO at the company was at Yum Brands before when they did a bit of a spin-off in China. So that is adding to the speculation that this could actually happen. Starbucks up 0.7% at the moment. And then finally, stable coins in focus once again. Fiserv doing a deal with Circle Holdings and PayPal potentially on a new stable coin called FiUSD, and all those stocks extending gains for a second day today on the stable coin excitement. And as usual, take a look at the before the bell opening wrap for a summary of all these news and more. Danny.
Yeah, those stable coin stocks really have been on a tear as of late. Joe, thank you so much. We'll catch up with you later in the hour. Also coming up this hour, we'll be speaking to Laura Cooper of Nuveen and Marvin Lowe on the market reaction or lack of market reaction to Middle East developments, along with the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, Daniel Shapiro. Conversations you do not want to miss. But let's get back to our top story. Israel has accused Iran of breaching a ceasefire after it detected missile launches. Its defense secretary has instructed the military to respond forcefully to Iran's violation of the ceasefire with powerful strikes against regime targets in the heart of Tehran. It comes an hour after President Trump announced on Truth Social early this morning the ceasefire is in effect. Please do not violate it. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed a short while later, writing in a statement, in Operation Rising Lion, the state of Israel achieved monumental historical successes and placed itself in line with the great powers of the world. Iran has yet to publicly confirm that it agreed to the ceasefire. Joining us now from Jerusalem is Bloomberg's Dan Williams. Dan, what do we know at this point as to whether or not the ceasefire has held?
Well, as you noted, it's fragile. There was what Israel described as a violation, a missile strike or a missile launch against its north. No casualties in that, although the fire service say they've located a fragment of that missile. It would appear that the Iranians are trying to distance themselves from this, effectively denying it happened. And for now, the ceasefire appears to be holding. Of course, as you noted, the Israelis say they will retaliate for this apparent violation. The question is if that's carried out. And to my knowledge, that Israeli retaliation has yet to be carried out. If that would draw a line under this episode and allow for the ceasefire to be pursued, or if that in turn would draw Iranian retaliation. Time will tell, but I think all over the region there's a sense of relief, a hopeful relief, that this ceasefire will hold. Certainly in Israel, you can feel the change of mood in the air after 12 days of really unprecedented war with Iran, unprecedented even by the standards of more than 20 months of regional war that began with a Hamas attack from Gaza in October of 2023. We should know in the coming hours whether the Israelis at least believe that this is being upheld and sustained.
Well, the Iran Foreign Ministry spokesman putting out on X saying that they claimed decisive victory against Israel, saying that they were forced, Israel was, to accept a one-sided ceasefire. Dan, what does Iran get out of this? Much has been made about their attempts to save face. Where do they stand now? What do they want, and what is really their goal in helping and continuing to observe a ceasefire if they are indeed doing so?
Well, they get a respite from what appears to have been a very significant drubbing by the Israelis. Israel says that it destroyed pretty much all of the Iranian nuclear project. It says that it has destroyed a substantial amount of the missile projects of Iran, more than 80% of missile launches, and that it has also struck at major figures when it comes to Iran's regional relations with proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like. If true, and there's no reason to believe it isn't, given what we've seen in terms of Iranian confirmation of many of those targets in the course of this 12-day war, it would appear that Iran could definitely do with some time to breathe, regroup, potentially even reassess its policies, its position on its nuclear program, its relations with the United States, and potentially down the line, its relations with Israel.
To that point, Dan, what do we understand about just how badly wounded Iran's nuclear program has been after this episode?
That's an enormous question, because what effectively was the final knockout blow as far as President Trump was concerned of this war, which enabled him to call this ceasefire, or as he prefers to call it, peace, or to urge the sides towards peace, was U.S. intervention with strategic heavy airstrikes against 3 core Iranian nuclear sites, including at Fordow, which was famously dug into a mountain, deep under a mountain, in a bid by the Iranians to protect it, to withstand conventional military strikes. Now, the Israelis have not been as categorical as the Americans in terms of damage assessment. They say it's too early to know. There's also an open question over the fate of 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that were believed to have been held at that site, and which, if loose, if unaccounted for, could potentially leave a vestige in terms of potential nuclear bomb fuel in the future. However, to judge by Israel's statement about accepting the ceasefire offer or proposal by Trump, Israel says it has achieved the goals of this war, of this operation. So Israel is at least formally saying it's war, it's basically declaring victory here and saying it's moving on, potentially to readdress or pivot to the Gaza war that began this entire cycle of regional fighting.
Dan, thank you so much for that update. That is Bloomberg's Dan Williams. Let's get the view from Wall Street now. Joining us is Laura Cooper, global investment strategist at Nuveen. And Laura, you've noted that these are markets that continue to chart higher despite the uncertainty, getting another leg higher thanks to this idea of a ceasefire, which it remains to be seen whether or not that's being tested this morning. Is it relief or is it misplaced?
I think at this point we are seeing a bit of relief coming through on markets, and perhaps this ongoing simmering geopolitical tensions does still warrant a small risk premium, predominantly in crude oil, even though it should be trading much lower. But I think from a broader market perspective, there were limited economic spillovers from what we were seeing in the Middle East. And I think markets instead are taking their cues from that incrementally dovish tone that is emerging now that we're seeing more division across FOMC members.
Can we talk about that? I mean, Mickey Bowman yesterday, Laura, it was really remarkable to hear her more or less endorsing a July cut. An FOMC official who was hawkish throughout the entirety of the Biden administration. Was that an audition, Laura? Is that what we should make of it?
I think one of the key takeaways from last week's meeting was just the degree of divergence that we are seeing across Fed members. So as you mentioned, Bowman has historically leaned quite hawkish, But in the past, more recently, we have heard other members like Kashkari, who is also, dovish leaning, is actually turning a bit more hawkish. So I think the tea leaves to read going forward will really be around the economic data. So while they are flagging that potential July cut, which markets are increasingly pricing in, we also get the CPI print for June only 2 weeks ahead of that meeting. And it is our expectation that that is when we're starting to see some of that tariff-led inflation effects feed through. So we're reluctant to have them cut in July. And if anything, looking at what Powell said last week, they expect those kind of material increases in inflation to play out over the summer. And they want to take this time to reassess. So while we still lean towards 2 cuts this year, we don't think July is really that kind of next pivot point at this stage.
Considering that July, to your point, Laura, you might not completely see the impact of tariffs. I mean, we've had all these companies front run, maybe still using products that haven't experienced the highest level of tariffs as they exist. Are the odds and potentials for policy mistakes even higher now if you do have Fed officials starting out there campaigning for a July cut?
Well, I think there is a lot of uncertainty around this because if we don't actually see those material tariff effects come through, and then we do start to see some cracks emerge in the labor market, we're already seeing some signs and that more timely indicators around initial claims, around jolts, around quits rates, then perhaps the Fed may have missed the mark in terms of easing because they will have waited too late. But I think echoing what Powell said last week, there's just such a degree of uncertainty in these markets. Yes, it has diminished since earlier this year, but again, they don't want to cut and then risk potentially having those inflationary pressures emerge. And to our mind, we're still looking at a core inflation forecast in the U.S. about 3% this year. So it's going to be hard for them to kind of have that front running of rate cuts in that type of environment unless they see that deterioration in the hard data. And as Powell said last week, the labor market still shows signs of being quite solid.
So interpret this, Laura, then, into what you do on this curve. It's been a curve that's been steepening. The front end has had a bit in the last couple of days, thanks to some of those comments from Mickey Bowman. Long end remains under pressure. The one big beautiful bill making its way through Washington, D.C., perhaps now in agreement on SALT. Is this bond market still investable? And if so, where do you want to put your money?
I think there are still ample opportunities in the U.S. rate space. I mean, to your point, even if we do see some amendments come through on the Senate in this big, beautiful bill, this is still a deficit that is probably going to climb from about 6% of GDP now to about 7% by 2028. And that does warrant greater compensation for taking those long end exposures. So we do think there is scope for the term premium to rise from here, and that does warrant a steeper curve. So that's a position we like. But as well, the front end of the curve, we think you're getting kind of that ample risk reward because you are kind of getting that carry. But in our view, one of the greatest mispricings in this market is actually the degree of rate cuts in 2026. Now, markets are going to be a bit cautious to start to price those in. But we think, the Fed is signaling only 1 cut next year. We're leaning more towards 3 with 2 this year. So the risk reward profile does suggest that kind of front end really is the place to be in maintaining that short duration posture.
Laura, really great to have you on this morning, finding some bits of certainty in the uncertainty. Laura Cooper, Global Investment Strategist at Nuveen. Now let's get you some other top stories that are trending on the terminal this morning. And NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has started offloading his shares. An SEC filing shows he recently sold 100,000 NVIDIA shares for about $14.5 million. This is Huang's first transaction under a plan that allows him to sell up to $865 million worth of stock by year's end. Amazon, meanwhile, is investing $54 billion into the UK in the next 3 years. The investment would include opening 4 new warehouses, and it's expected to create thousands of new jobs. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called it a massive vote of confidence in the UK as, quote, the best place to do business. And passengers on a Qantas flight bound for Paris spent more than 15 hours in the air, only to end up back where they started in Australia. The flight from Perth made it into Indian airspace before an Iranian missile attack closed the airspace in the region, forcing it to turn around. Coming up, Powell heads to Capitol Hill for a semi-annual testimony. He's expected to talk about the potential impact of the Iran conflict on inflation and get grilled from Congress on why they haven't cut. We're going to have more on that next on your brief. It's your Bloomberg Brief. I'm Danny Berger in New York. Fed Chair Powell will be on Capitol Hill kicking off his two-day semi-annual testimony. He's expected to explain why interest rates are likely to remain steady till at least September. Now, elsewhere in Washington, President Trump posting on Truth Social, we should be at least 2 to 3 points lower. It would save the USA $800 billion per year. We'll be paying for his incompetence for many years to come. The board should activate. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Bill Ferries. The board should activate, sounding like like a cool superhero move. Bill, what are we expecting? What sort of grilling is Powell going to be getting on Capitol Hill?
I think it's going to be a pretty rough reception, particularly from Republicans who are going to carry that message from President Trump saying, why aren't you already moving on rates? How much could you conceive of cutting in the coming months, in the coming meetings? Why don't you get ahead of this ball? I think that's what they're going to be pounding on. I think Democrats are going to be saying, where is the inflation? When will the impact of these tariffs really start to show up at the grocery stores and at the markets Americans are shopping at? So that's going to be from both sides, I think, a lot of incoming fire. The president has been on Jay Powell to cut rates basically since he took office in January. His reasoning has changed at times. But as some of these more recent inflation reports have come in lower than forecast, that has kind of helped Trump kind of double down on this message that he thinks the central bank president needs to be moving more quickly.
Well, his reasoning as of late, as we just saw in that Truth Social post, would be to save the U.S. money because of the amount it's paying on interest. And at the same time, the one big beautiful bill is making its way through Washington, D.C., with deficits set to expand. It seems like there is an offer on the table for a SALT cap coming from the Senate bill. Does it seem like there is a potential agreement that will be reached between the two chambers of Congress on this matter?
Yeah, on SALT, there's a possibility of some sort of a deal coming together. The big picture is this is that $4.2 trillion tax package that the president has basically made his main focus of his legislative agenda at this point. The deal that seems to be working out on the Senate side is that they will keep that $40,000 state and local tax deduction, but they will change the threshold potentially at when it starts to phase out. The bill from the House side said incomes up to $500,000 would get that full SALT deduction, and then it would start to peter out a bit after that. What the Senate is perhaps floating at this point is, could we lower that from $500,000 to some other level? We don't know what that level would be, but we are getting signals from Republican House members who have really drawn a line in the sand over the $40,000 SALT deduction. They're saying, yeah, we can talk about that. Now, that is one issue in this big package. There are still other issues around energy tax credits, around things like Medicare payments to rural hospitals that could still hold the legislation up. The Senate is coming in today. They're hoping to vote. They want to vote this week. That could be this weekend. If they can do that, it gets it back to the House in time for a House vote, and they could still make that July 4th deadline that the president said. That said, there are Republican senators who say publicly, at least, they're not so worried about July 4th. Sometime a few days later might not be the worst thing. But the president, when he sets these deadlines, he tends to want to see them get met. I think the Republicans in the Senate and the House are going to still aim for that.
Yeah, the clock's ticking, about 10 days to go. Bill, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Bill Ferries. Coming up on the show, we're going to take a look at what's making headlines around the world. That's up next on your brief. Welcome back to your Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger in New York. It's time now for your front page news. Let's take a look at what the major outlets are running as their top stories this morning. First up on the New York Times, President Trump surprising some of his own top officials with the Israel-Iran ceasefire announcement. According to a senior White House official, the president abruptly made the announcement on Truth Social after speaking to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Iranian officials, with Qatar helping to mediate. Iran yet to confirm the ceasefire. Next up on the Wall Street Journal, federal law enforcement officials are on high alert for domestic retaliation in response to U.S. strikes on Iran. According to a source, FBI officials were told to shift resources towards Iran and domestic threats after manpower in recent months had been focused on immigration enforcement. And finally, on the FT, Congress is weighing a multi-billion-dollar tax cut for private credit investors as part of President Donald Trump's flagship spending plan. The proposal would limit taxes on dividends paid to investors in business development companies. Congress's nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that the tax break would cost $10.7 billion to 2034. All right, as we head to the end of the half hour, a quick look at oil this morning. The fall continues, although the bond market, it is the front end getting a bid this morning, down a basis point. Some of that rally has ebbed, but yesterday, Mickey Bowman floating the idea of July cut. Coming up, markets shrugging off geopolitical concerns from the Middle East. We're going to have more with State Street's Marvin Lowe. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg. It's 5:30 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Danny Berger with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know on this Tuesday morning. Ceasefire tested. Israel accuses Iran of a new missile launch after a truce announced by President Trump. Iran reportedly denies the accusation. A tax bill compromise. Senate Republicans consider an agreement on SALT provisions as they aim to pass the legislation next week. And Fed Chair Powell heads to Capitol Hill for his semi-annual policy report. It has been fragility in the Middle East. Are we or are we not in the midst of a ceasefire? Even so, it is oil that keeps falling this morning. At one point yesterday, we were at $80 a barrel. Look at where we are now, just below $69 a barrel, with declines continuing of 3.5%. You can see that little tick higher there early in the hour was due to reports that Iran had fired a missile into Israel. Iran denied that. However, when it comes to this equity market, the rally continues, though. We are up more than 1% for both the NASDAQ and Russell 2000 futures, S&P just under 1%. And gains for this bond market have been ebbing this morning, somewhat fueled by lower oil prices, but really it is a front end that has been rallying thanks to more Fed comments about a July cut, Michelle Bowman being the latest of which. Your 2-year yield is down 2 basis points, little change for your 10-year, while the 30-year continues to sustain losses. Let's now catch up with Bloomberg's Joe Easton, who has your stocks to watch. Good morning, Joe.
Hey, Danny. So we are seeing decent moves higher in the airlines today. United, American, Delta, JetBlue, all gaining by around 3% or at least 2%. At the low end, it's the double hit for the sector in terms of a double boost. We are seeing the oil price coming down, of course, boosting sentiment on a positive side, and also easing disruption in the Persian Gulf as companies announce resumptions of flights into key cities like Dubai. So we are getting a boost across the airlines today. Keep an eye on that one. And then we move over to Starbucks. I could probably do with some more coffee myself, to be fair, but Starbucks bouncing around today. The company facing a report that they are going to potentially spin off their Chinese unit. They have actually denied it in recent moments, but there was a report overnight, and the CEO previously did a bit of a Chinese spin-off at his last company, Yum Brand. So it's adding to the speculation around this. Starbucks up 1% this morning. And then over in the stable coin space, something I don't know too much about, but I've had to learn about. Fiserv actually potentially doing a deal with PayPal and also Circle as well on a stable coin tied to the dollar. It's called Fi USD. A lot of excitement around this sector. Circle has doubled in value over the past 5 days on this stable coin excitement. So all of those shares, Fiserv in particular, in focus, up 5% heading towards the open, Danny.
Joe, we could all use an extra cup of coffee these days. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
That is Joe Easton there. All right, let's get back to our top story this morning. The latest on Israel-Iran developments, with Israel saying Iran had launched a missile. Iran denying that accusation. Bloomberg Horizon's Middle East anchor Jomana Bersetchi joins us now from Dubai. Jomana, what do we understand at this point?
Really fast-moving developments, Danny. The main highlight, I would say, from this morning is the fact that President Trump put out a post overnight saying that the two sides, Iran and Israel, had agreed to a ceasefire agreement. Now, after that, there was a lot of ambiguity about the timeline of that ceasefire, when exactly it went into effect. And what you saw was an exchange of blows from both Iran into Israel and Israel into Iran right until the very last minute. Now, in fact, the IDF has said that Iran just this morning launched 6 ballistic missile volleys into Israel, causing the death of 4 people, and that one of the missile attacks actually happened after the ceasefire was supposedly implemented. Now, Iran are trying to walk away or distance themselves from having fired those ballistic missiles after the ceasefire. But here is the situation as we know it right now. Israel have now said that they have signed on to this ceasefire agreement. We got an announcement from the Prime Minister's office a couple of hours ago saying that they have signed on to this agreement. The Israeli Prime Minister will be giving some comments later today to talk about it, but that also Israel have achieved their, quote, war goals in Iran. So it will be interesting to hear more commentary around that. And then Iran, I would say, have given a tacit acknowledgement of the ceasefire by saying that by issuing a statement affirming the national decision to impose a cessation of war, and they are framing it as a victory, perhaps a reframing to save face from the Iranian perspective. So yes, there's been a lot of moving headlines this morning, but it is fair to say, I think, that most of the region is breathing a sigh of relief this morning. You can see it in some of the regional bourses. They're trading north of 2% firmer, and that this situation did not broaden out into a regional conflict. And even the so-called calibrated Iranian retaliation on the U.S. strikes that took place at the U.S. base in Doha yesterday was very telegraphed, very choreographed in advance, and it sort of drew a line under that episode. Looking forward, there are going to be questions about how sustainable this ceasefire is going to be, and also whether this brings Iran back to the negotiating table.
Jomana, thank you so much for that update. That is Bloomberg Horizon's Middle East anchor Jomana Bersetchi. Now, State Street senior global macro strategist Marvin weighs in on the lack of market reaction from geopolitical headlines, writing, quote, the market's ability to shrug off the evolving conflict in the Mideast is encouraging, but also speaks of complacency when applied across all asset classes. I'm pleased to say that Marvin joins us now. Marvin, really great to see you this morning. And I know you go on to say, look, the impact on corporates themselves is limited, but that uncertainty should show up in parts of investor portfolios. Where should it show up?
You know what? Really, the whole trend between having comfort with U.S. companies and maybe having a little bit less comfort with, U.S. government assets, if you will, between the dollar and treasuries is kind of the disparity that we're generally monitoring closely. So I would think that it's the dollar that shows it the most. I would think that it's treasuries that show it the most. And, certainly we're getting a reversal of some of the initial movements across those two asset classes yesterday with, again, as you mentioned, long yields a little bit higher, and the dollar certainly a little bit more on its back foot than what had been the theme that was driving things yesterday.
Well, this is the thing with the dollar, Marvin. It feels like good economic data, the dollar sells off. Bad economic data, the dollar sells off. Concerns about war, the dollar's little change. Those concerns go away. The dollar falls. I mean, the trend seems unrelenting of a weaker dollar, Marvin. What, if anything, wakes it up?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's hard to see how we break that cycle because, the dollar smile, if you will, which has always been this theme that has supported the dollar, has really turned into the dollar frown. And, that frown keeps getting deeper on the downside, if you will. There are still a lot of questions on trade. And, I've generally held that if you have smaller trade balances, there's ultimately less demand for the dollar. That takes quite some time to play out. We do know that investors are underweight dollars to a significant degree that we haven't seen in the last 5 years. There's going to be choppiness around that, but I think until proven differently, until we get a much clearer signal of what the dollar is in the global trade world, as well as where interest rates are, kind of with all these cross currents with the Fed seeming to be fighting amongst themselves in terms of what the next move is. It still spells weakness for the dollar.
What do you make of that, Marvin, of Michelle Bowman yesterday seemingly endorsing a July cut, someone who has been more hawkish, especially for most of the Biden administration?
Yeah, for sure. And, she's joined by another one of the more hawkish voices in Chris Waller recently. I think there is a bit of interviewing going on, to be honest with you, with regard to the next Fed chair. For better or for worse, everyone is looking past the if you will, the lame duck period for Powell, and we're going to start seeing some of the more likely candidates voice their views, which theoretically they are interviewing with the administration. And politics is supposed to be outside of the Fed, but it is creeping in, certainly.
Well, at the moment, it really is just Michelle Bowman and Chris Waller. Goolsbee, though, saying that if tariff air clears, they should proceed with a cut, not as stark as those. But if politics is behind this, Marvin, does that increase the likelihood of a policy mistake? Does a divided Fed turn into a more dovish Fed that forces their hand to cut, maybe when the data hasn't fully reflected the extent of tariff inflation?
Yeah, I mean, I still really adhere to the sacrosanct nature of the Fed. The way the board is established, the majority rules, if you will, approach that the Fed has. It does make it a bit more challenging. It probably makes it harder for the Fed to adapt quickly when you've got a lot of these disparate voices. Kind of having said that, the inflation and economic environment is one where doing nothing still makes the most sense to me and seems to make the most sense to the members on the board. And, we'll be operating within that kind of context until we get closer to really the changing of various guards that happen next year.
Well, we're going to hear from Chair Powell on Capitol Hill today. He's going to want to do nothing and change nothing and have no market reaction. Sure. Marvin, thank you so much for joining us. Marvin Lowe of State Street, always a pleasure to have you on. Coming up, we're going to speak to one of the leading voices on the Middle East, that is former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Daniel Shapiro, will be joining the Bloomberg Brief coming up next. You're watching Bloomberg Brief. I'm Danny Berger in New York. The NATO summit is kicking off in the Netherlands as the Israel-Iran truce announced by President Trump getting tested just hours after its enactment. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook joins us now from the summit taking place in The Hague. Oliver, just how much is this going to be dominating the NATO summit?
Well, listen, it's already overshadowed the NATO summit. There was some question about whether or not Donald Trump would come if there was not a ceasefire, and he had his hands full with the Iranian and Israeli question. But it seems that he's going to be embarking on this journey in just about 20, 30 minutes time and come here to The Hague, where you will find a very receptive audience here of NATO members at this summit who will commit, in all likelihood, to spending 5% of their GDP towards defense spending. This is an absolutely huge raising of the defense targets that we've seen from NATO previously. It has been at 2%, and we should say that over the last sort of decade, if you take out the United States, the average defense spend has been about 1.6%. So hitting that 5% is a huge sort of foreign policy coup for the Trump administration. We should say it's not a pure 5%. About 3.5 of that is going to be on the heavy military hardware, tanks, guns, ammunition. 1.5 of that is going to be a little bit freer in terms of how it can be classified, cybersecurity, infrastructure, those sorts of things. And we should say that also the target is to reach that by 2035. And that is something that many members of the eastern flank of NATO are not terribly happy with. That being said, this is a massive coup for the Trump administration coming in here. There has been a little bit of dispute about whether or not the Spanish will get on board and fall into line, but that is sort of the expectation going into this summit. Really a monumental summit, and really as just been saying, really a turnaround for the European defense picture, and really a big win for the Trump administration as he prepares to arrive here at The Hague.
Oliver, looking forward to your continued coverage. That is Bloomberg's Oliver Crook at the NATO summit. I'm pleased to say that joining us now is Daniel Shapiro, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former U.S. ambassador to Israel. He was also the former deputy assistant secretary for defense for the Middle East. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And look, as you know well, ceasefires in the Middle East are often fragile and fleeting. Israel saying that missiles were launched from Iran denying that. What do you make of the state and the likelihood of a potential ceasefire at this moment?
The ceasefire is shaky, Danny, and yesterday, or I guess several hours ago, just before it went into effect, Iran fired off some last barrages of missiles. There were fatalities in Israel. I think 4 people at least were killed in one of those strikes, and then at least a few of those missiles were fired even after the ceasefire went into effect. Well, Israel is going to respond to that, I think, in the hours to come, and it sounds like they feel they have the Trump administration's backing to do that. This often happens as you try to negotiate a ceasefire to a conflict in the Middle East. Everybody wants to get in the last shot. And so sometimes it goes overtime and the ceasefire takes a little longer to take hold. But I do think both sides need this. They both need this off ramp. And so I expect within the next 24 hours or so, it's more likely than not that the ceasefire will actually take place.
It kind of speaks to this idea, Ambassador, of saving face. And from the Iranian side, I mean, you had a president that thanked Iran more or less for its very weak response, giving them early notice. How does Iran at this point, which defending itself, or rather nuclear armament, had been something of a domestic policy, what now? How does it show that it hasn't kowtowed to foreign powers?
Well, Iran was badly damaged during this series of strikes over the last 12 days or so, first by Israel with its strikes on military targets, on leaders, on missile targets, on their nuclear facilities, and on various regime locations. And then the Trump administration, of course, with the big strikes Saturday night that did significant damage to 3 important nuclear facilities. So Iran's been badly hurt. What's most important to Iran is really to preserve the regime. And so what they need right now, first is a break. They need to catch their breath. And they need to try to do 2 things, which we need to balance in our negotiations with them. They're going to try to sustain their ability at some point to resume progress on a nuclear program. It's very important that we, the United States and our partners and allies, get into negotiations with them to get them on the other path. To give up the enrichment capability that gives them the possibility to break out to a nuclear weapon. What might make that possible to reach an agreement on is that Iran really needs to provide something to its people. They've suffered, obviously, through years of its misrule. They've suffered during this conflict. And there could be held out sanctions relief that would give the chance for the regime to bring some benefit to a very sputtering Iranian economy. But in exchange, it's going to have to give up that nuclear program.
To that point, it is a fractured population already that you're hinting at, a brittle hold from the Islamic Republic on governing its people right now. Is there a real risk, Ambassador, that you see something of a fracture or break that comes from more radical forces within Iran?
Well, the regime, as I said, is somewhat destabilized. Certainly, this is not a popular regime. Estimates by real experts tell us that maybe something like 15 or 20% of the public really actually believes in this regime's ideology. The rest are either of different ethnicities or they've been persecuted by the regime for expressing opposition. And so there could be fissures. And if there's some kind of organized opposition, there's even a possibility this leads in the direction of some kind of regime change. But one version of that regime change, as you suggest, could be a military takeover or a coup that brings to bear even the most hardline elements of the country's leadership. So there's some risk here. Frankly, I'm hopeful that the Iranian people will find their voice and find a way to insist that they be ruled by a regime that actually respects their human rights, that doesn't want to show aggression against its neighbors, that doesn't want to squander the resources of this great country on foreign adventures and ideological crusades. But that's something that's going to happen internally if it happens, and the Iranian people are going to have to find their voice to do it.
Well, if there is a weakened hold of the Islamic Republic, how does that color what we're going to see in this diplomatic effort going forward?
Well, this, as I said, the regime has to try to show some strength, try to preserve some of the assets that it wants. Of course, that nuclear program was always part of their belief that if they could achieve the nuclear weapon, or at least be on the threshold of it, that itself would be a form of stabilizing the regime and holding off external threats. We've got to try in negotiations with support from our European partners, from our Gulf partners, for example, Qatar, that helped yesterday to negotiate the ceasefire, get Iran to understand that its future and the future even of this regime, if that's what it's most motivated by, trying to preserve, is better guaranteed by giving up that nuclear capability that would otherwise lead us potentially back into conflict, and pursuing a path that doesn't require conflict with other neighbors, that stops wasting resources on military campaigns, on sponsoring terrorist organizations, and that brings sanctions relief and a return to the international economic community that Iran hasn't really been able to participate in for 25 or 30 years because of their own behavior. That's a tall order. I don't know if this regime, this 86-year-old Ayatollah, or those still alive who are advising him, or those hardline elements still with influence in their system, can get there, but that's got to be the direction we try to push them on.
Is there a risk that almost the opposite lesson is learned from this, not just from Iran, but from various forces around the world, that something like this could have been prevented if Iran already had nuclear capabilities? Does this not fuel others to hurry up and get their hands on something like that?
Well, that dichotomy already existed. It's well known. It's sort of sometimes referred to as the Libya versus North Korea model. North Korea, which inched forward and then eventually did break out to become a nuclear weapon state, is now somewhat invulnerable because they have that nuclear capability. Libya, which had a nuclear program but gave it up through negotiations, ultimately saw the overthrow of their leader, their dictator, Mohammed al-Gaddafi. And that that's why some countries and some observers have suggested that a country like Iran or others might find that having the nuclear weapon is the better way toward regime stability than giving it up. That risk was always there, and Iran played on that risk by sitting right on the threshold of nuclear capability. They had, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, 10 bombs worth of 60% enriched uranium that they could have enriched to 90%, which is weapons grade at almost any time in just a matter of days or a few weeks. They had been researching how to actually weaponize that uranium if they ever got the decision from the supreme leader to do so, which they had not, but could have done in a very short period of time if he gave them that decision. And so we were right on that threshold anyway. And so it was necessary, either through negotiations or, in this case, through military means, to push them back from that threshold. But again, you're right that they or others might try to get back on that path and think that's a path to security and stability. We have to disabuse them and any other actor to try to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons into the hands of those who really can't be trusted, especially if they're highly aggressive states, as Iran has been since the revolution in 1979.
Ambassador, we really appreciate your time and your thoughts this morning. Thank you for joining us. Daniel Shapiro, former U.S. ambassador to Israel. This is Bloomberg. Let's get you set up for your trading day on this Tuesday. We're going to get Carnival scheduled to report its earnings before the bell. FedEx will be after the market close. And then a host of Fed speak throughout the day: Hammock, Williams, Kashkari, and Collins. But the main focus will be Fed Chair Powell's testimony starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, and any continued movement out of the Middle East. We're just speaking with the former ambassador who says a ceasefire may take days to take hold. That is it for Bloomberg Brief on this very hot day in New York City. Surveillance is up ahead.